Marcus Octavius, Aedile 50 BCE. A stalwart conservative in the tradition of his great-grandfather and namesake, Marcus Octavius was one of the most dedicated Pompeian officers, seeing service in Illyricum, Greece, and Africa. His tenure in independent command is relatively well attested due to the anonymous continuator of Julius Caesar's commentaries. Here, we see Marcus Octavius rallying the survivors of Pharsalus and the Illyrians to keep the war in the Balkans alive. After a fascinating, albeit failed campaign and an escape straight out of an action movie, Octavius then rejoined the other Pompeian holdouts in Africa. After capturing a single warship in his capacity as co-commander of the fleet, Octavius vanishes from history. I will argue that Marcus Octavius's combination of minor commands, failures, and kinship to a far more famous figure on the other side of the battle lines meant that he was doomed to be relegated to obscurity. Although he lacked a cognomen, Marcus Octavius was from a well-established plebeian gens Octavia, and the family had produced a few consuls by the time that he was born. While most of the holders of the consulship from his family had been named Gnaeus, Marcus was lucky insofar as he shared a more famous name associated with Octavius, and that was the name Marcus. His most well-known ancestor, Marcus Octavius, had been tribune back in 133 alongside of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. The two men at one point had been friends, but they had fallen out after Gracchus started to propose land reform. Marcus Octavius took up the side of the landed aristocracy and stood against Tiberius Gracchus, which had then forced Gracchus to depose him from office in an unprecedented measure, which upped the ante and eventually led Tiberius Gracchus's opponents to have him executed. So Marcus Octavius from 133 had played a pivotal role in the drama that sort of marked the boundary between the Middle and Late Republic. And because of that, Marcus Octavius had a name that had a certain power when it came to resonating with the more conservative faction in Rome. This is also interesting because Marcus Octavius from 133 is also a common ancestor that Marcus Octavius shares with his very famous younger cousin, Octavian. For our Marcus, he is a great-grandfather, and for Octavian, the future emperor, he would be a great-great-grandfather. The two men were distant cousins of some kind. Marcus's own father was Gnaeus Octavius, who served as consul in 76, and presumably he would provided a great deal of guidance for young Marcus. If we look at Octavian's father, Gaius Octavius, of course Octavian is an anglicized version of the name Octavius. Gaius Octavius was a new man. He came from a different branch of the family, and he was a rising star in Roman politics. Most likely, as a young man, Marcus and Gaius would have known each other, with Gaius being the elder of the two. But Gaius, despite rising to the praetorship in 61, died early. However, before he died, he did make a very advantageous marriage alliance with Aedile, who was a niece of Julius Caesar, thus meaning that gens Octavia now had a marriage link with a patrician family, even if it was one that hadn't really done anything in a few centuries at that time. But this also meant that Gaius Octavius and his son Octavian would be partisans of Caesar, whereas Marcus Octavius, the subject of today's video, would be on the other side of that, following in the footsteps of his famous great-grandfather. We don't know enough about the relationship between Marcus Octavius and his cousins to know if there was any real friction about how Gaius Octavius had married Aedile and sided with the populares, but in all likelihood Marcus Octavius was a bit disappointed with his cousin. That being said, he was the representative of the larger branch of the family, and so he most likely didn't lose too much sleep over it. Not to mention that it was not at all uncommon for different members of the same family to go different directions politically. In the past, we've talked about many examples of that happening, including how one of Cassius's cousins was in fact one of Caesar's major lieutenants in Spain at one point. As for Octavius, Marcus Octavius that is, he was born around 85 BCE, give or take, perhaps a couple years later, and the first known event in his career is that he was elected as edile in the year 50. The year before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. And at this time, the First Triumvirate was falling apart, and it was not at all certain that there would be a conflict between Caesar and Pompey. In fact, if we look at a lot of Cicero's letters, there's a pretty good reason to think that most Romans had no real idea that a crisis was coming. During that year, it appears that Octavius's primary concern, alongside of his colleague Marcus Caelius Rufus, was to secure panthers for games at Rome. And in order to secure panthers, they wrote to the current governor of Cilicia, who would be Marcus Tullius Cicero, the famous orator and a friend of Caelius. And Cicero responded that he would do his best, but he was really concerned that it would endanger the lives of the people he would order to go hunt and transport panthers. And we never really learned from the correspondence whether Cicero actually followed through with this, or whether he told them later that he had failed in his endeavor to secure panthers for them. At any rate, their edile ship expired, and much like any edile ship, it was mostly uneventful, and we don't really hear of too many dramatic happenings, meaning that they must not have really knocked it out of the park, but because there were no riots over a lack of entertainment, apparently they did well enough. In early 49, the Senate engaged in perhaps the most meaningful and impactful debate in its history, as different members were scrambling to try to work out a compromise between Caesar and Pompey before a war started. We don't really know what Marcus Octavius was up to during that crisis, as he simply wasn't senior enough for anyone to care what he thought. Most likely he voted with the majority when they voted in favor of a compromise brought forth by Curio the Younger, whereby both men would lay down their commands at the same time in order to avert war. Ultimately, however, a small number of hardliners were able to carry the day. Caesar was ordered to either disband his army or be declared a public enemy, and famously Caesar decided to cast the die and cross the Rubicon. After Caesar's invasion of Italy, Marcus Octavius found himself with Pompey and many of the senior senators over in Greece. Now Caesar was faced with an important strategic choice. Should he go after, as he termed it, the general without an army, i.e. Pompey in Greece, or should he go after the army without a general, i.e. the legions that Pompey had under his command in Spain, without any real commander? And of course Marcus Petrius and Afranius were there, but Caesar of course dismisses them in his witticism. Caesar famously goes against the Spanish legions, and therefore Pompey has more time to organize over in Greece, and he raises a large army there, but all of largely inexperienced troops. The other problem from the perspective of the command staff is that there are many high-ranking officials and not a lot of commands for them to hold. So quite a number of the men on Pompey's side felt like their dignity was being slighted because there were simply no sufficiently high offices for them to hold. For Marcus Octavius, as a relatively junior official, this meant that he had no chance at any kind of independent command, really, as the war began. In fact, he would end up as the co-commander of a small squadron of ships, and for some reason these ships were teamed together. So you have an Achaean squad from central Greece, and you also have a squadron from the Liburnians, who are a tribe of Illyrians. And these two were put together and also given joint command between Lucius Scribonius Libo and Marcus Octavius. Of the two, Scribonius Libo was probably a little bit more prestigious simply because he was married into Pompey's family. He was the father-in-law of young Sextus Pompeius, Pompey's second son. However, because Scribonius Libo was called upon to do more than simply command ships, he would often be absent. And so this meant that in many ways Marcus Octavius was the effective commander of this unit, and because this unit had ties up in Illyricum, which was a theater formerly occupied by Caesar, this would mean that Marcus Octavius would have a number of occasions where he could exercise independent command. So we're going to look at the operations he conducted with Scribonius Libo, and then later the ones that he did all on his lonesome. When it came to personnel problems, Caesar had the precise opposite problem of Pompey. Whereas Pompey had men who were massively overqualified for various commands, Caesar had to promote loyal men to posts that were well beyond their experience. And one of the men he turned to was Gaius Antonius, who was tasked with defending Illyricum with about a legion and a half worth of soldiers. Gaius Antonius would also be supported by an admiral with no real experience, the Roman playboy Dolabella. At the same time, when Octavius and Libo went up north, they were quickly able to drive off Dolabella, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, Dolabella had helped to transport Antonius's men onto the island of Charicta. And so when Dolabella was defeated, this meant that 15 cohorts were now stranded on an island. And as they were started to go hungry, one of the senior centurions, Titus Pullo, of Rome, the HBO series fame, but this being the real Pullo, not the one who is very much fictionalized for the show, led the men in a revolt against Gaius Antonius, and he led them to defect to the Pompeian side. By the way, these men famously would fight at Pharsalus, and there's a very good chance, though it's not mentioned explicitly anywhere, that Pullo was killed in action at Pharsalus. So although it makes an appealing story for him to be the real father of Caesarion, and to then escape with Caesarion into anonymous exile, the truth is that he probably died in Greece in 48. When this defeat is combined with the defeat of Curio the Younger's army in Africa, this was something that helped to really restore the morale of the Pompeian cause, because we have to remember that in early 49, not only had Pompey fled from Italy and then had his armies in Spain smashed, but also the treasury at Rome had been abandoned and had fallen into Caesar's hands. So the early part of 49 was all Caesar, and then by the time we get to the fall, it was all Pompey. So the actions by Octavius and Libo were crucial in helping to balance things out a little bit. And for the most part, it appears that the credit here probably went more to Libo simply because he had that connection with Pompey. But Octavius apparently did well enough that Pompey felt comfortable removing Libo to work on diplomatic matters and letting Octavius return to the theater later and operate by himself. The bulk of the Pompeian fleet was under the command of the former consul Bibulus, and their task was to prevent Caesar from crossing the Adriatic. Pompey realized this was the most probable way that Caesar would enter the Greek world, but he also knew that there was a threat that Caesar would give in to caution and march overland through Illyricum. And in case that happened, he wanted a force present to detect the Caesarians and give him an early warning, and also to try to secure part of the area as a kind of beachhead. And so he decided to send Octavius back to Illyricum with his 2 squadrons. And once here, Octavius got to work and set himself up as the Pompeian governor of sorts of the parts of Illyricum that he was able to bring under his control. He made alliances with the Dalmatians, one of the major tribes in the area, and he was also able to persuade the important island of Isa to break with Caesar and join the cause of Pompey. That was a pretty major defection, as it definitely sent a shockwave through the Caesarian ranks a little bit. Only the community at Salona was able to really hold out. So Salona was one of the bigger cities in the area, and the Roman community here had ties with Caesar, and although they were threatened and there was no Caesarian army nearby to be had, they decided to resist in Caesar's name, which led Octavius to begin a siege. The siege looked like it had a very good chance of success, despite the fact that it was being held in January and February. Octavius put up 5 camps around the city to block all entrances and exits. He had put up his siege towers, and the city was not particularly well stocked, so it looked like this was going to be a success. However, because the citizens of Salona were so dedicated to either Caesar's cause or more likely their own survival, fearing reprisals from Octavius, they took a lot of measures to make sure that they would win. One thing they did early was to free all of their slaves. That way there would not be any particular reason for the slaves to betray them and open the gates. And after a few weeks of the siege, when Octavius's men began to slacken their efforts, what the citizens of Salona did was to send the women and children up to the walls dressed as soldiers to make it look like they were doing their normal routine of defending the city, while all the men got together and sallied forth early in the morning. and this enabled them to capture all 5 camps in rapid succession. Octavius was caught with his pants down. He was not able to rally, and so he and his men were driven back to their ships with heavy losses, and after this he decided to go join Pompey's main force at Dyrrhachium. And for the rest of the overland campaign in Greece, Octavius was one of the many officers who served at Dyrrhachium and later at Pharsalus, although he didn't really have a major role to play in either of these 2 pivotal battles. If we think about the valor that Octavius displayed in his early campaigns and the valor that he's going to display when he returns to Illyricum, we have to assume that most likely Marcus Octavius acquitted himself honorably when he fought at Dyrrhachium and Pharsalus. But again, we must remember that there was probably nothing for him to do in the army at the time except for fighting the front ranks, simply because the army was so brass heavy. And even if he had the ability to go into the war councils and speak, most likely all of his suggestions would have been ignored simply because this was a deeply rank conscious camp, more so than most because of how many senior senators were there and how many of them were so jealous of their prerogatives, especially men like Metellus Scipio. All of this would change for Octavius after the defeat at Pharsalus. Not only did a number of the chief Pompeians die, but the army was scattered to the 7 winds, and Octavius, who was able to keep his cool, managed to rally a sizable force of refugees and lead them back west into Illyricum. And once he got there, he was able to reconnect with the local elites he had been dealing with back when he had been the admiral in the area, and he began to reestablish his command district. He was still without orders, but he was acting on his own initiative, and he was able to create quite a stir. If we read between the lines in Caesar's commentaries, which, if we're looking at the book that these events are recorded in, that would be the Alexandrian War, which was anonymous, it's pretty clear from the way that it's written and the phrasing that the majority of the Illyrians were either in the tank for the Pompeian cause, or else they simply were trying to take advantage of the civil war between the Romans to try to assert their independence. So Caesar did not have too many adherents in the area outside of Salona and a couple of other places. And so Octavius had gone to exactly the right spot in order to try to create mischief. And this would be a fairly interesting campaign, and Octavius had a reasonably high chance of really upsetting Caesar's plans, so he made quite a good strategic decision by going here. As had been the case the previous year, Caesar was once again forced to turn to a young man with little experience to be his governor in Illyricum. And in this case, the governorship in 48 was far more important, given that Caesar might well have to retreat through Illyricum if things went poorly in Greece. He turned to Quintus Cornificius, a man at this point who was better known for his poetry than for his politics. Yet Cornificius would prove to be a capable governor, and he would give Octavius a run for his money. When Octavius arrived in the area and began to break away different Illyrian cities, Quintus Cornificius sprang into action. He knew that he didn't have the ability to fight Octavius head-on, but he did know that he needed to check his advances while he awaited friendly reinforcements. And so Cornificius went to a friendly city, gathered a few ships, and launched an attack, taking out a few of Octavius's straggling vessels. While this was hardly a brilliant naval maneuver, what it did do was establish a bit of caution on Octavius's part, because otherwise he might well have decided to gather his forces and make straight for Cornificius and his 2 legions, take them out, and then have the Illyrians flood into his camp. But because Cornificius showed initiative early, Octavius decided instead that he was not yet strong enough to try conclusions with Cornificius, and instead should build up his power base before he went after the commander. And it's unclear whether Octavius could have simply gone after Cornificius, but certainly the Caesarian account of the battle suggests that that was the case, and that Octavius made a huge error by not going directly for Cornificius and trying to force a decisive battle early. Of course, we'll never know, and it remains the case that this was more the case of Cornificius pulling off a relatively clever ruse and showing strength he didn't have, and it also shows once again that perhaps Octavius was not a military genius, since he clearly failed to apprehend that Cornificius did not really have a navy of any sort. Having decided to play the long game rather than risk a confrontation with Cornificius early, Octavius continued to conduct coastal operations in order to build up his power base. The author of the anonymous Alexandrian War, one of the continuators of Caesar's commentaries, says derisively that he was cutting treaties with the Illyrians, which is a way to say that he was coming up with deals that were sneaky. So the idea here is that he was going behind the backs of the Romans and doing these nefarious things. That being said, if we dismiss the source bias here, it's pretty clear that that was a wise course of action. The Illyrians were famous for their prowess in warfare, and clearly they were holding Cornificius at bay for the most part in inland Illyricum, so they were quite effective, and this was a wise strategy to pursue. In the meantime, with his small navy and his loyal Roman troops, he was moving along the coast and attacking various garrisons. So Caesarian garrisons were being besieged, and it's also clear that many of those cities did fall, although our sources don't bother to name most of them. The Caesarian account, in fact, tends to focus very heavily on the activities of the various legates responding to Octavius's activities. So we know a great deal about Cornificius, and we also know about Aulus Gabinius and Publius Vatinius. That being said, if we read between the lines, the speed and haste of their arrival suggests that Octavius had found a very effective strategy and that he was pursuing it competently. So this was a major threat to Caesar's operation, and as I noted when I talked about Cornificius, Caesar's main fear was that Pompey might either arrive in Illyricum to take command personally, or that he would rally in Macedonia and then perhaps Octavius could march over to him and Pompey would have a ready-made nub of an army. And so this was a pretty wise operation on Octavius's part, and it did mount a pretty considerable threat to Caesar, as we see from Caesar's responses to what Octavius was up to. While not all that many senior officials had sided with Caesar in 49, one former consul had sided with him, and that was Aulus Gabinius, who had served as consul in 58. However, Gabinius had refused to deploy as an army commander in 48 because he had formerly been associated with Pompey, and he didn't want to fight against him under arms. So up to this point, Gabinius had largely been a pro-Caesarian neutral. However, he had been tasked with raising 2 new legions in Italy, and the crisis was such that Caesar decided it was time for Gabinius to commit himself. So he ordered Gabinius to invade Illyricum with 2 additional legions in order to help out Cornificius, and not really knowing exactly the strength or dispensation of Octavius's forces, Caesar gave Gabinius orders that were not entirely clear. Gabinius was to aid Cornificius, perhaps going through the country, winning over a couple cities, and then ultimately trying, if possible, to get his forces into Macedonia. Because again, Caesar suspected that Pompey wanted to try to re-emerge somewhere in Macedon. Now, as the campaign developed, Gabinius ended up bungling the whole thing. Even though he was marching in winter, he figured that he would be able to find plenty of supplies in Illyricum, so he did not really take care of his baggage train. And without those logistics, he was counting on plunder in order to keep his men supplied. However, all of the strongholds he attacked resisted his advances, and this is largely because his men were inexperienced and they were fresh recruits. So his various assaults failed, he started to run out of supplies, and he was forced to retreat to the friendly city of Salona. He had already lost a couple thousand men and many of his officers, and then he too up and died. So this meant that the relief effort, so far as Octavius was concerned, had failed. And we don't really know how involved Marcus Octavius was in trying to undermine Gabinius's efforts, but most likely because he was sending reassurances to the various Illyrians and the friendly garrisons that might be out there, this most likely gave them the courage to resist Gabinius, and that may have played a part. Most likely Octavius didn't take a very active role in foiling Gabinius, but still he played a role. And with Gabinius gone and his army beleaguered at Salona, there was every reason for Octavius to think that he now had this in the bag. and that he had foiled the largest relief effort. It appears also, by the way, that he didn't know that a second commander had been summoned, and that this commander was just about to arrive. Quintus Cornificius had not only written directly to Caesar, but he had also written to many of his other fellow commanders, including the fleet commander at Brundisium, Publius Vatinius. The fleet at Brundisium was not a fully equipped battle fleet, and it had been greatly reduced by deployments elsewhere, and also by losses in battle. In fact, recently it had actually been under siege. But by the time that Cornificius' request came through, Vatinius was free to act, and so that's exactly what he did. So he gathered up the fleet as it existed, and the key advantage that he'd be able to enjoy is that many of the convalescent veterans who had remained at Brundisium when Caesar had gone to Greece were now whole and hearty. So many of these men were veterans of the Gallic Wars, but they had missed out on the campaign in Greece due to illness or injury, and now they were back among the healthy. Many of them volunteered to serve as Marines, and so with very high quality infantry on his deck serving as Marines, Vatinius set out for Illyricum. It's worth noting that a lot of his ships were not really battle-worthy, and there's a weird detail in our account where there are hastily attached parts on some of these ships, as if they were hastily repaired, and the idea is simply to respond quickly and rely upon the experience of the Marines and not really worry about the seaworthiness of the vessels. And while many of these ships are supposed to be fast and small, meaning that they're probably pentaconers, ships that are smaller than a sort of formal warship, there was at least one quinquereme, and that was the one that Vatinius would use himself. So this was a fleet which had some fighting power, even if it was not necessarily something that would win a major battle. Vatinius arrived and seems to have achieved surprise at Octavius' expense. He was able to retake several towns that had recently fallen to Octavius, and at one point he would have made himself known unambiguously to Octavius because Octavius was in the middle of laying siege at Epidaurus, and the siege was broken up by Vatinius' fleet. Up to this point, it's not entirely clear how much intelligence Octavius had about Vatinius. Most likely he'd heard something, but this was the first time he'd encountered him in person, and it's likely that given how shy he was about facing Cornificius, that Octavius had also decided to dodge Vatinius. But once he realized that Vatinius' fleet was small and hastily scraped together, he thought, well, I've got a good chance of just defeating him head on. I've seen his whole force, so that's exactly what I should do. So Octavius decided to gather his fleet and seek out a pitched naval battle. Up to this point in the campaign, Vatinius had been the pursuer, and Octavius had been the prey. So when Octavius decided to turn and fight, he was able to achieve some element of surprise, and this was further aided by the fact that a storm was about to break out, and so visibility was not great, the sky was overcast, and it took Vatinius a minute to spot Octavius sailing out to challenge him along the coast. When they clashed, Vatinius was in a more strung-out formation that was not ready for battle. They weren't completely out of position, but they weren't in an ideal position, whereas Octavius's ships were formed up perfectly for battle. We also have to remember that Octavius had a better fleet overall. It was larger, and the ships seemed to have been higher quality in general. So, by all reasonable expectations, Octavius had perhaps an 80% chance of winning going into this battle, since he had a higher quality fleet, he had a little bit of surprise, and he had a better starting position. So, probably due to Vatinius's action, what ended up happening is the two flagships, Octavius's quadrireme and Vatinius's quinquereme, ended up colliding head-on. So normally you would ram a ship from the side. Ramming from the front is foolish. So my suspicion is that Vatinius knew he was at a disadvantage, and he needed to take out Octavius early to create confusion and give himself a chance to overcome the odds. When these two ships collided, they got caught in one another, but because Vatinius had the heavier ship, Octavius got the worst of it, and his ship began to sink. The fighting on board was pretty fierce, but of course Vatinius had all of the Gallic War veterans on his side, so the fighting on deck favored Vatinius, and the other ships seem to have kind of converged upon the wreck and started to fight on deck, which played right into Vatinius's hands, since the only advantage that he had was better marines. So Octavius fought on desperately, and he eventually was thrown off of the deck, just like many of his men. Most of his men, however, drowned. As for Vatinius, he would ultimately carry the day due to his superior marines, and when the day was done, he found himself in possession of one more quinquereme, and why Octavius didn't opt for that as his flagship is anyone's guess. He also was able to pick up 2 of Octavius's triremes, 8 biremes, and a large number of rowers as well. So this ended up being a relatively comprehensive victory for Vatinius at Taurus. That being said, Octavius didn't really do anything wrong here. He kind of just got unlucky. And he did fight very hard, at least on a personal level. But again, it does show that Octavius was never in contention for one of the spots on the great captains list either, as he did everything by the book, and he wasn't able to overcome an unexpected maneuver by his opponent. The author of the Alexandrian War was not particularly impressed or interested in Marcus Octavius. However, he does seem to have some level of admiration for Octavius's personal courage and the way that he survived the Battle of Taurus. So as I mentioned, his quadrireme went down, and many of the crew died. Most people in the ancient world, by the way, did not know how to swim. Apparently Octavius did, and so he quickly made for one of the lifeboats. But because so many other men who didn't know how to swim were also trying to get on board, the lifeboat foundered, and without the lifeboat, now a wounded Octavius, and it's unclear whether he was wounded because of the lifeboat or because of the battle, had to now swim. And luckily for him, he had the foresight to plan an escape vessel. So he had a light ship, probably a pentaconter, fitted out with a good crew, and he was able to swim over to them, get on board, and then get out of Dodge. And this escape was very much aided by the fact that not only was it almost nightfall, but also the storm that had been brewing now broke. So there was rain, and visibility decreased even more. And so Octavius and his veteran crew on this light ship were able to make an escape. However, the ship does not really seem to have been fully equipped for a long voyage, so they had to make a stop at the island of Isa, which was still friendly, to take on provisions and then head out. And Vatinius, one of his top priorities was trying to apprehend Octavius, and apparently he arrived not too long after Octavius had left the island of Isa for the last time, only to discover from the locals, who of course reverted to Caesar, that in fact Octavius was making his way to Africa to rejoin the other Pompeian exiles and to try to pick up the cause there. Following a grueling campaign in Illyricum and his epic escape from the Battle of Taurus, Octavius had the great good fortune of arriving in Africa just in time to be present for the great command dispute. So in the wake of the Battle of Pharsalus, the biggest Pompeian stronghold left was Africa. Publius Aetius Varus had been governor here, and he had successfully withstood an attack by Curio the Younger. And while Aetius Varus had not done that well militarily, he had been bailed out by the Numidians. And so he ultimately had prevailed, and in the intervening time since his victory in late 49, he had built up the defenses in the army in Africa. Well, more senior officers who had escaped Pharsalus were now arriving and claiming to have precedence. Among them were the praetor Cato the Younger and the former consul Metellus Scipio. Cato the Younger ultimately persuaded his various colleagues, using his moral authority and his charisma, that they should honor the rank system of the Roman Republic, and that Metellus Scipio, by rights, should be the new commander-in-chief. Metellus Scipio, of course, for his part, thought the same, and he also believed that he was the most capable person for the job. And so, much to the chagrin of Publius Aetius Varus, command went to Metellus Scipio. One has to imagine that for Marcus Octavius, this was a slap in the face. Maybe not quite as big of a slap in the face as it was to Aetius Varus, but it was still a pretty big insult in many ways. Men like Octavius and Varus had been keeping the cause afloat by creating secondary fronts from nothing. by winning battles or creating distractions, and ultimately their services were not as valued as they should have been because, again, the Pompeian cause was so obsessed with rank and precedence, and achievements in the actual war were not terribly valued. So the two men were assigned to an almost insulting command, which was co-command of the modest fleet that Varus had managed to assemble. And this was not a very big flotilla by any means. They also were tasked with trying to defend the entire coast of Roman Africa against the landing. In general, intercepting an enemy fleet is difficult under the best of circumstances, but if you're defending a massive coastline, it becomes that much harder. The only real hint that they had to go on is that most likely, due to the norms of sailing in the Mediterranean, Caesar's men would stop in Sicily and hug the coast and then make their way south. But that was not enough intelligence to actually allow them to intercept the enemy fleet. In fact, between them, they managed to intercept one ship. So one ship fell out of the convoy, probably during a storm, and then it kind of foundered a little bit until it was captured by Octavius and Varus. In the meantime, Caesar was able to disembark his men, he was able to keep his ship safe in the harbor, and then he was able to fight and win the Battle of Thapsus against the aforementioned Metellus Scipio. So again, the efforts of men like Aedile Varus and Octavius in order to keep the war running were not always exactly rewarded with a commensurate amount of respect or subsequent responsibility. Due to his relatively junior position, Marcus Octavius can count himself lucky that his activities are recorded in such detail up to this point. However, after his stint as a naval co-admiral in Africa, we don't know anything about what he was up to for the rest of his life. He's neither recorded among the dead in Africa, nor among the many suicides among the Pompeians, nor among the Pompeians in Spain, and had he done that, he certainly would have been recorded, as there weren't that many senior Pompeians left at the time. And usually Caesar and his officers would list the prominent men who had received a pardon. So perhaps it's possible that Marcus Octavius simply wasn't considered important enough to write about, and he did get a pardon and went back to Italy for a time. It's also possible that he died around this time of natural causes. While he was not very old at the time, he would have been in his mid-30s, he had been exerting himself hard, and we know for a fact that he was wounded in Illyricum. So it's possible that he died of natural causes, but again, we don't really know. The most likely outcome, actually, is that most likely he did receive a pardon, and then he went back to Italy. He lived quietly for a while as he watched his distant cousin, the younger Gaius Octavius, rise to prominence, and then, perhaps out of jealousy, he sided with Mark Antony, and was one of the co-commanders of the fleet at Actium. And if so, given his previous track record as a naval commander, it stands to reason that Mark Antony was not successful at Actium. But again, we don't really know for sure what Marcus Octavius' fate is, but I would say there's at least a 50% chance that he once again found himself as a sub-commander, and once again found himself on the losing side while in control of a number of ships. Marcus Octavius, frankly, has no legacy, but he was nonetheless significant. As we discussed, he did manage to create a new theater of war, or at least to reignite an old one, and this forced Caesar to dedicate a number of resources that could have been better used to go pursue Pompeian refugees elsewhere. So rather than retreating and allowing Caesar to proceed forward using his momentum, Octavius went back to a familiar theater of war and restarted it. And as we mentioned, he pursued a fairly effective strategy in this theater of war by aligning himself with local Illyrians and using his fleet and its mobility. However, when it came to actually fighting field battles, Marcus Octavius was not terribly effective. And he went 0 for life in field battles unless we count his early victory against Dolabella, where he was co-commander with Scribonius Libo. This makes him a fairly perfect heir to his more famous great-grandfather, who had been the tribune in 133, a man who had resisted Tiberius Gracchus to the bitter end, but ultimately had been overridden. But unlike his more famous ancestor, Marcus Octavius was on the losing side, and so his sacrifices ended up counting for naught. Because he had worked with the Illyrians, the very conservative Romans who pined for the days of the Republic had trouble really trying to make him out to be heroic, because he worked on a secondary theater, he was relatively low in rank, he cavorted with non-Romans, and he also hadn't won any major battles. In addition to that, if you study how he commanded his troops, he was a bit battle-shy. While he had some fairly good strategies, he did not do well in pitched battles, and he also tried to avoid them. Which means that he was kind of like the George McClellan, if we're being as generous as possible, of this conflict, except far less important and successful. And so the Republicans of later years couldn't even play up the fact that he was a relative of the man who ended their political system, and that it shows that there was good and bad in every family. They couldn't even do that because Marcus Octavius didn't give them enough to work with in terms of trying to build a narrative to make him out to be one of the great martyrs of that last generation of the Republic. And of course, because he was on the wrong side of the Civil War, from the perspective of Augustus, this means that he really didn't have a role to play in the story of Augustus. So when Augustus is talking about his various relatives, there's really no reason to mention this Marcus Octavius. After all, if this Marcus Octavius had had his way, Augustus's reign would have never been possible. So because of that, Marcus Octavius really has no legacy, because he doesn't really fit into anyone's narrative and doesn't give them all that much to work with. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.